Yesterday, we were talking about totem and taboo and beyond. In the first lecture, we were talking about totem and taboo and beyond, which formed the basis for the next two lectures. In the presentation, the second presentation today, I'd like to talk about two different forms of psychopathology and a way of looking at a myth and ritual correlate to each of them and being able to give them a position in cultural evolution. We're going to be skipping along through a tremendous amount of information. And unfortunately, I'll have to abbreviate a lot of it, but it still will be a lot of information. But today I'll be talking about the brief psychotic disorder, autism, and their myth and ritual correlates. In 1913, Freud wrote Totem and Taboo, in which he offered a reconstruction not of the events behind the veil of childhood amnesia, but the events behind the veil of the prehistoric amnesia of our ancient ancestors. In our dim historic past, he suggested, human lived in small groups under the domination of a strong and despotic father. Expelled sons wished to overtake him and possess the women. They banded together and killed the father. This occurred countless times and became a part of our phylogenetic memory. The brothers banded together, renounced full instinctual gratification, acknowledged the rights of the others and their obligations to one another. They created the origins of religion, specifically totemism, in which the dead primal father was worshipped and mourned as an ancestor spirit in the form of an animal or plant. Fundamental to totemism are exogamy and totem worship. In exogamy, marriage outside the clan, incestuous wishes are managed, and in totem worship, the killing of the father is denied. In fact, the totem animal or plant becomes sacred, must be protected, and it is only killed and eaten in some cultures as a sacrament. The totemic feast suggests the cannibalistic feasting upon the body of the murdered father. The early religions were characterized by great mother goddesses, and later still by great mother goddesses and their sun god consorts. After the age of the mother goddesses, the goddesses receded and the sun gods gained in importance. With the sun gods came the emergence of the mythology of the heroes and dying gods, and the beginning of the patriarchal era of the god kings and the king gods. Roheim modified Freud's vision of our ancient past by eliminating the Psycho-Lamarckian assumption that the crimes of the past, the murder and cannibalizing of the primal father, repeated on innumerable occasions, became a part of our phylogenetic inheritance. And in its place, he offered an ontogenetic perspective. People did what they did over and over again, not because they remembered it from their phylogenetic past, but because it was in the structure of their beings and a response to the childhood traumata of their personal lives. Roheim wrote, quote, "Humanity has emerged as a human being emerges today by the growth of defense mechanisms against the infantile situation, by the development of the unconscious." With Psycho-Lamarckism dismissed, the analogical relations between psychological development, cultural evolution, psychopathology, myth, and ritual were given a new context. Freud had loosely associated a stage of normal development with the that is, the Oedipal stage, with a form of psychopathology. Freud was a little bit vague in this area, neurosis and neurosis in general, and more specifically obsessional neurosis, a stage in cultural development, totemic culture, a myth, maybe the myths associated with totemism, ancestor worship, the Oedipus myth, and a ritual, the sacrificial totemic feast. And the points of agreement are metaphors embedded in each of the seemingly disparate phenomena. These points of agreement or metaphors in common are 1. The desire for the mother and the horror of incest, and 2. The desire to kill the father and the adoration of the father. But in truth, it was a loose set of associations, full of vagueness and contradictions, and it is a credit to Freud's genius and courage that he left it in such condition for others to muse upon. Now in 1962, a Jungian named John Weir Perry made a contribution that warrants our attention. Perry, a student of C.G. Jung in Zurich, worked with patients with brief psychotic disorders and paid particularly close attention to the metaphors, or archetypes as he would call them, embedded in his patients' delusions, hallucinations, and artistic expressions. He recognized that in spite of wide individual differences, there were 10 recurring images and themes. There was the center as an image, the sense of being located at a world center or cosmic axis, between opposing halves of the world, at the center of attention. These people going through this brief psychotic episode would describe themselves being at some sort of a cosmic center. Death was another image or theme. The themes of dismemberment or sacrifice, crucifixion, pounding or chopping up, tortures, limbs or bones rearranged, poisoning. A common delusion, of course, is of having died and of being in an afterlife. A third one is return to beginnings, a regression back to the beginning of time and the creation of the cosmos, and a parallel regression to the emotions, behavior, and associations of early childhood. There was the image of cosmic conflict. There's a world conflict of cosmic proportions between the forces of good and evil, or light and darkness, of order and chaos, democracy and communism, the Christ and Antichrist, things of this sort. Threat of the opposite. There's a threat of the opposite sex, a fear of being overcome by it or being turned into it. There is apotheosis, the feeling of becoming a god. The person experiences apotheosis as royalty or divinity. They say, I'm the king, or I'm the queen, a deity, a saint, a hero, a heroine, a messiah, etc. There is the image of a sacred marriage. The person enters upon a sacred marriage of ritual or mythological character, a royal marriage, perhaps an incestuous marriage, marriage with God or a goddess, the Virgin Mother conceived by the Spirit, things of this sort. New birth. A new birth is taking place or is expected of a superhuman child or of oneself. There are ideas of rebirth, the divine child, infant savior, prince, or reconciler of the divisions of the world. There's the image of a new society, a new order of societies envisioned, or an ideal or sacred quality, a new Jerusalem, a utopia, world peace, a new age. And finally, the 10th image or theme in this case is of a quadrated world. A fourfold structure of the world or cosmos is established, usually in the form of a quadrated circle, 4 continents or quarters, 4 political factions, etc. The reason such images and themes are described in such religious terminology is that many psychotic patients, sunk in the narcissism of the psychotic episode, are so emotionally charged and to such an extent that they speak in just this way. The other is that Perry discovered that these same images and themes, occurring spontaneously in the brief reactive psychoses, or brief psychotic disorders, also appear among some of the oldest texts describing the myths of sacral kingship and the ancient New Year's festivals. This myth and ritual pair appears to have emerged spontaneously and or by diffusion in cultures all around the globe, as they struggled with the turmoil inherent in the transformation from the high Neolithic to urban living, that is, the birth of civilization. Perry's research also led to a discovery that many of the world's great visionaries had what we would call today brief psychotic disorders at some time in their lives, and that these were the wellsprings of their world-renovating visions. The following is a typical case that Perry described. The case is that of a 27-year-old single woman. She felt herself to be cold and teasing toward men and didn't like herself for it. She had the delusion she was a witch and had the evil eye and magic power. She also identified with Queen Elizabeth I as a cold and ruthless figure of power. She thought the San Francisco Bay Area was being engulfed by fire or water and dropping down to become a new hell. We have the image of the center. She was being punished for her evil and wanted to be baptized. She thought she died and was in an afterlife, image of death. She had visions of the creation of the world, early evolution, and of the first primitive peoples migrating across continents and over the English Channel to the British Isles. She was preoccupied with sinister visions of holes in the earth she had known in early childhood and thought herself back there again. She felt very young. Again, return to the beginnings. She was frightened at being caught up in a world power struggle between communism and democracy, the cosmic conflict. She was at the center of plots and counterplots, both sides wanting to make use of her knowledge, and feared being poisoned. She believed the feminine women were being sent away to South America to be given work, leaving only the masculine women to deal with the men. Here again we have the thread of opposite. One day she had the vision of Moses, Paul, and Luther, and in a great exultation received the revelation that she was to be the fourth and the leader of a new religious era. Each holy man was a reincarnation of the same great divine spirit. We have the apotheosis. There were vague allusions to her being a new virgin mother, but this was kept secret and overshadowed by a greater picture of things to come, possibly a sacred marriage. When the San Francisco Bay Area became the new hell, a new Bethlehem would drop from the sky in spaceships, and the whole new order was to be brought to the world as an achievement of science, a vision of a new society. This city was to be understood as a new version of the heavenly city, the New Jerusalem, and its place as the center of the world. There was to be no one new Savior, but every oldest son was to be the Son of Man, and all were to be perfect men, knowing everything of importance for human welfare, even as children. As a result, people were to have wisdom to enable them to live sensibly together in peace. Now, in one of his books, Roots of Renewal in Myth and Madness, Perry summarizes the myths and rituals of kingship at the beginnings of civilization in 16 different cultures. Civilization is defined by the political structure of kingship, the invention of the calendar and writing, large-scale armies and war, city living, and the emergence of the gods associated with the urban revolution over the goddesses of the Neolithic. The following is Perry's summary of the ritual drama of renewal from ancient Egypt. This is just one of the 16. He describes the Egyptian Sed festival, in which the main enthronement of the king and the New Year's ritual of the earliest dynasties takes place. And this was in the early 3rd millennium BC. The time was the beginning of spring and the subsiding of the Nile flood or inundation. First, we have the image of the world center. The ritual took place in Memphis, the center point between the upper and lower Egypt. The throne was placed on a raised podium representing the primeval hill, the first land to appear at the time of creation, the center of the world, charged with vital power, radiating out into the whole kingdom. The image of death was evident in this ritual of the New Year's festival, insofar as in the last few days of the season of inundation occurred this ceremony in which the dead king, father of the living king, becomes Osiris through a ritual of purification and transfiguration and rebirth into a new life in the beyond as Lord of the kingdom of the dead. And his son is enthroned as the sky god, Horus, Lord of the kingdom of the living. The vital force that gives life to the kingdom is transmitted from the ancestral realm of the dead through Osiris in his embrace of his son, the living king. After the funerary rites and on the first day of spring, the king is crowned and as the living embodiment of Horus. So you have a king god, which is Osiris, and a god king, which is the Horus, his son. So there's this intimate relationship between this king god and the god king. And a special emphasis on the relationship of life to the realm of the dead. 3. Return to the beginnings of time and creation. As the king stands high over the land on his dais, this is in the ritual of the said festival, he is personifying the first divine king and creator, Atum, standing on the primeval hill as it arose from the waters of chaos. The hill was the place of the creation and of rebirth and of resurrection. So the cosmogonic mythology is incorporated into this New Year's festival, the said festival. 4. Cosmic conflict as a clash of opposites. Horus has to avenge the death of his father, Osiris, by doing battle with his uncle Set. The ritual represents the sacred combat as a mock fight between the men of two cities of the Delta, designating the forces of death as against those of the living. 5. Threat of the reversal of opposites. For a while, death and the enemy hold the upper hand, and there is a period of chaos in which there is a suspension of the normal order of the real. 6. Apotheosis as king or messianic hero. The coronation and the investiture of the king as the living Horus extols him as a victor, as one with the first king god, Atum, and as partaking of the nature of the sun god, Re, ruling over the entire ordered world. 7. Sacred marriage as a union of opposites. The occurrence of a sacred marriage is not certain in this particular ceremony, but at the other New Year's festivals associated with the ancient Egyptians, because there are a number of different kinds of New Year's festivals they had, there is well-documented marital rites, notably at Edfu, where Horus was brought to the temple of his mother and consort Hathor to cohabit with her for 2 weeks. 8. New birth as a reconciliation of the opposites. The motif of rebirth and resurrection runs through the entire series of rituals as a dominant theme. It primarily concerns the transfiguration of the dead king, Osiris. So he's dying to be reborn. 9. New society and the prophetic vision. There is a coronation rite that signals the creation of a new epoch, a new time of harmony between society and nature, yet partaking of the qualities of the original time of creation. Okay? So there's the idea that we're initiating a new world order. And finally, a quadrated world forms. The representation of the quadrated world recurs throughout these rituals in the baptismal purification rites at the start. The king is given water by the 4 gods of the cardinal directions, conveying their life and power to him. At the enthronement, he is seated 4 times on 4 thrones in the cardinal directions, conveying their life as power to him. And he is proclaimed to each of the quarters of the world as an arrow is shot by him into each one. Perry describes the myths of sacred kingship and the ancient New Year's festivals. In ancient Egypt, the Shilluk, Mesopotamia, Canaan, Israel, India, Iran, the Hittites, Mycenae, Athens, early Rome, Etruria, classical Rome, the Norselands, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, and in the Far East in China. While Freud had the inspired intuition to create the vague associations between psychological development, cultural evolution, psychopathology, myth, and ritual, Perry was able to establish a strong correlation, a one-to-one correlation, between the urban revolution, the beginning of civilization, with the brief psychotic disorder, the myth of sacral kingship, and the ancient New Year's festival. And the linking phenomena were metaphors. He would call them archetypes, but I think I can call them metaphors. One thing that Perry left out, and that was the final linking of these different aspects to a normal stage in ontogenetic development. And yet I knew Dr. Perry, and I felt that it was quite clear to me that what he was talking about was adolescence, wherein you have the idealism of the adolescent, the creation of worldviews. They have their cosmic conflict. They go through their thread of the opposite sex. They have their ideas about the future. They are creating, a career choice and sexual identity. And when I spoke about this with him, he either agreed or could certainly see my point. But he himself rarely addressed that stage in normal psychological development. He was more focused on the psychopathology and these other aspects. Okay, but I wanted to introduce that little piece to say, okay, here is where we situate this in terms of normal development. Now, in 1975, I began working with a 9-year-old autistic boy, inviting him to draw freely and telling me what he could about his drawings, though his speech was limited and very disturbed. Over a period of 5 years, he drew 1,250 pictures of circles, which he described as mouths. He said the mouth bites, has terrible teeth, and has a star in it. His interest in the mouth seemed not too surprising, as autistic children are widely recognized to have speech and eating disturbances. Bruno Bettelheim wrote the damage around the oral experience and extreme oral aggression are part of the origin of the disturbance. Francis Tustin wrote, quote, "It has become clear to me that a crucial factor in the precipitation of the autism was the realization that the nipple of the breast was not part of the mouth, but was separate from it and could be gone. This had been enraging and terrifying." Unquote. Freud, of course, wrote of the first stage of psychosexual development as the oral stage, and between Freud and Abraham, they elaborated the two subphases of the early oral stage, of the sucking stage, followed by the later oral stage or cannibalistic stage. In 1950, Bertram Lewin, in his book The Psychoanalysis of Elation, introduced the oral triad of wishes: the wish to devour, the wish to be devoured, and the wish to sleep or to die. The nursing baby, of course, wishes to eat and wishes to sleep, and spending so much time in the early months of life doing so, the physiological needs become psychological wishes. The wish to be eaten is derived from the fact that the infant, satiated after suckling, has experiences of yielding, relaxing, and falling, which get organized into ideas of being devoured. Lewin identified the components of the oral triad in psychopathology, normal functioning, and in diverse cultural contexts. The wish to sleep was associated with the wish to die, and the wish to die with the wish to return to the mother. Fenichel addressed not the wish of being eaten, but the dread of being eaten, and points out that it is indissolubly linked with the ideas of castration, typically by the mother, and associated with incest wishes in the form of wishes to return to the womb. Fenichel demonstrates that oral incorporation can take place via the respiratory function of inhaling and smelling. He offers several case examples and ethnological data. The Latin word anima, for example, means at once breath, life, soul, wind, and smell. Elaborating the idea in Psychopathology of Coughing, Fenichel says that coughing is a means of discharging irritating physical stimuli, but certain neurotics may cough as a means of discharging a kind of inner psychic stimulus. He notes that breathing, like eating, carries the magical function of introjection and reprojection, and is characterized in clinical material as well as in ideas about demons and their exorcism. In an exploration of the symbolism of the mouth as it appears in myth and ritual, we find it to be an image with no fewer than 5 basic symbolic meanings, all of which interrelate to varying degrees. The mouth is 1, the hero's passageway to death; 2, the birth canal of the reborn hero; 3, the avenue through which the soul embodies; 4, the avenue of the soul's disembodiment; and 5, an image of integral consciousness. The first 4 of these 5 meanings involve the mouth functioning as a passageway between light and dark, consciousness and unconsciousness, birth and death. The first 2 meanings pertain to the myth of the hero. The hero can be thought of as being associated, though not identified, with the ego. In dreams and fantasy, the hero figure performs tasks that no ego could ever perform, but in doing so expresses in metaphor the person's wishes, fears, and conflicts. Thus, the paths of the ego as a metapsychological concept and the hero as an imaginary and mythological figure are distinct and yet in some ways parallel. When we encounter images of the death, dismemberment, or swallowing of the hero in myth or dream life, we may view it as a symbolic expression of the parallel extinction of ego consciousness or the end of a previously established worldview. It is exemplified in experiences of drifting off into sleep and psychotic decompensation, wherein the worldview is dismembered. Boundaries are dissolved and ego consciousness is obliterated. While the hero's death and dismemberment may seem final from a literal perspective, from a figurative perspective, the hero's death may represent a return to the mouth womb of the great goddess, with the potential of spiritual rebirth, the birth of consciousness, or the birth of a new worldview. The mouth as a birth canal for the hero is symbolic of this upper birth. The image of the hero being reborn from the mouth is a metaphor for awakening, psychological birth, the reconstitution of the ego following a psychotic episode. It represents the remembering of the worldview or the establishment of a new worldview. On ancient temples, restaurants, and modern fun houses, it is not uncommon for the doorway to be framed by a large open mouth through which one enters and leaves. The emerging or descending hero can also be seen in the jaws of the dragon on the Alfa Romeo insignia. The third and fourth meanings of the mouth refer to it as a passageway for the soul. The literature indicates that when the soul enters the mouth or is swallowed, it also experiences engulfment, as it is departing from the expansive supposed celestial realms and entering into the limited world of human existence. In this sense, the soul, by entering the mouth of the human body, undergoes a kind of death, like that of the hero. But just as the death of the hero is associated with a return to the mouth womb, so the death of the soul is associated with embodiment. Naturally enough, the soul's leaving the body by way of the mouth represents a kind of birth or a liberation of sorts, and is associated with the so-called wandering of the soul in dreams, visions, and fantasied afterlife journeys. As such, the soul's exit out the mouth represents a disembodiment. In many traditions, illness is also attributed to the soul having escaped by way of the mouth. It's important here to note the complementary relationship that exists between the hero and the soul, in which the swallowing of the soul is always associated with the birth of the hero, the ego, and the swallowing of the hero, the ego, is always associated with the liberations, wanderings, and travels of the soul. Soul goes in, the hero comes out. Hero goes in, the soul comes out. That's how the schema would look like. The fifth symbolic meaning attributed to the image of the mouth is that of integral consciousness. In this context, the mouth may represent a vessel containing the universe, or simply be the organ from which divine wisdom comes forth. We now turn from this schematic matrix of meaning that I have attributed to the mouth to the some actual mythological data from which the schema is drawn. We begin with the image of the mouth as the hero's passageway to death. The mouth, as an image of death, destruction, and dismemberment, is the gate to the underworld, the jaws of hell, the devouring terrible mother, the vagina dentata, and time itself, the devourer of all things created. When in the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna reveals to Arjuna his infinite celestial forms, Arjuna is awestruck and filled with terror, for he sees, among other things, Lord Krishna's many mouths, terrible teeth, and fearful fangs, in which the heads of mortals are being crushed to powder, and still other fiery mouths destroying all the worlds. In the mythology of the Greeks, it is prophesied by Mother Earth and her husband Uranus that their son Kronos would be dethroned by one of his own sons. In an attempt to circumvent this, Kronos made a practice of swallowing each of his children, as Rhea, his wife and sister, bore them. A shamanic amulet carved in walrus tusk from the Tlingit Indians of Alaska depicts a terrible mother figure about to devour a person whom she holds in her clutches. A picture from 16th century Aztec codex depicts Quetzalcoatl, the great plumed serpent, devouring a person in his jaws. In a myth native to the Manja and Banda of Africa, a hairy black being named Ngakola was said to live in the bush and was known to eat people and vomit them up renewed. He told the people, "Send me men, I will swallow them and vomit them up renewed." The people did as they were instructed, but Ngakola only vomited up half of the men. So the people went and they killed Ngakola and established their secret society, in which the novices are swallowed, taken into a house which is said to be Ngakola's body. In the house they are tortured and said to be digested in the belly of Ngakola. Then they are vomited up, renewed, and initiated. This image of the mouth as a site of renewal or rebirth, or a birth canal for a second birth, a higher or spiritual birth or psychological birth, refers more to a spiritual awakening than to a physical birth. This motif of death, swallowing, and rebirth, disgorging, found in the myths of the Manja and Banda, is also common in other cultures and often plays an important, if not integral, role in the initiation rites of their adolescence. This motif of swallowing and disgorging the deity is common to myths and rituals among the Polynesians, the Australian Aborigines, some native North American tribes, various tribal peoples in Africa and South America, just to name a few. The most familiar version of this motif in Western culture is, of course, the myth of Jonah and the whale in the Old Testament that we see here. A Polynesian myth tells of a hero named Nganoa who was swallowed along with his boat by a kind of whale. Nganoa propped open the monster's mouth with the mast of his boat and then descended into its stomach, where he found, who else, both of his parents still alive. He then lit a fire, killed the monster, and re-emerged from its mouth, liberating himself and his parents. We turn now to the image of the mouth as a passageway for the embodiment and disembodiment of the soul. In Chinese and Japanese mythology, it is said that the flaming orb associated with the pearl, sun, and moon is symbolic of wholeness. It was originally held in the mouth of the lung, or dragon, but was wrestled free by mortals. Ever since that time, the dragon is said to have steadfastly pursued the flaming orb. Depiction of this pursuit continues to be one of the most popular themes to this day in Chinese and Japanese art. Here we have it. In a Swahili creation myth with Islamic influences, God was said to have spoken a word which entered through Adam's mouth and spread life through his body. Briffaut says that women in Germany used to be afraid that a snake would slip into their mouths while they were sleeping and cause them to become pregnant. Other tales tell of women being impregnated by swallowing a petal of a rose or a bug. In an ancient Egyptian creation myth, Khepera had union with his clenched hand. He masturbated and poured his seed into his mouth and spat forth his son Shu and his daughter Tefnut. In Egyptian mythology, it is the eye of Horus that represents the treasure hard to attain. The eye is said to have been a composite image of the sun in the mouth, wherein the white of the eye, framed by the eyelids, is shaped like the mouth, and the retina and pupil like the sun. As such, the eye was said to be symbolic of the creative word. In Asian shamanism, when the shaman is conducting a healing, he may breathe in deeply in order to swallow the souls of his ancestors and other spirits he may have summoned to help him in his work. In an 11th or 12th century German painting, we see a woman lying on a bed, dying, while her naked soul is escaping from her mouth. In a woodcut from an alchemical text, the Theatrum Chemicum, a man is shown in the deathly state of the Negredo, while out of his mouth there have flown two bird-like figures with human heads, symbolic of the soul and spirit. In addition to the mouth as the departure point for the soul, there are also numerous European paintings illustrating exorcisms in which the exorcised demon is seen departing by way of the mouth. With regard to the mouth as a symbol of integral consciousness, we find in the tales of Pindar, Homer, and Sappho that all acquired their gift of verse by having bees, creatures symbolic of the soul and the mysteries of transformation, alight on their lips when they were young. In the creation mythology of the Ngaju Dayak of Borneo, the cosmic totality was conceived of as originally lying undivided in the mouth of a great coiled water serpent. In an ancient hymn, in an Indian tale of Lord Krishna's youth, the child is said to have been eating clay when his foster mother heard the news of his mischievousness and went to scold him. Upon her arrival, he wiped his mouth clean and denied her accusation. Not believing him, she opened his mouth and looked inside, only to find that it contained the entire universe. She then closed his mouth and thought herself silly to think that her son was Lord of the universe. In a late 19th century tantric Indian miniature painting, Shiva is depicted lying on his back, making love to Mahavidya Chihinamasta. As a tantrika, he withholds his semen and redirects the sexual energy, the kundalini, up the sushumna, or passageway through the 7 chakras. The 7th chakra, located at the crown of the head, is called the Sahasrara chakra and is associated with higher consciousness and oneness with God. The Sahasrara chakra is also known as the mouth of God. In this particular painting, there emerges from the crown of Shiva's head a tiny little head with its mouth open, the mouth of God, spewing forth the river Ganges, or the river of life. Returning now to the autistic dilemma, I find that nothing describes the dilemma quite so well, though admittedly only poetically, as that of a soul unwilling or unable to embody. This conclusion is based on the notion that it is in the union of the soul and the body that the psyche gives birth, so to speak, to the hero and the ego with it. The ego, of course, is either absent, weak, or damaged in the case of the autistic child. Thus, it seems to me at least, that the image of the mouth that this little autistic boy was drawing, the image of the mouth that he was preoccupied with, and around which all autistic children have their conflict, may be, at a symbolic level, expressive of the soul's inability to fully embody. I recognize fully that I'm speaking in a very poetic way, and yet, at this level of consciousness, if you can call it that, I think we probably don't have much more than poetry. So bear with me while we begin to put a few of these pieces together. Delving still deeper into the symbolism of the mouth, we turn now to the ritual and find the task of embodiment beautifully illuminated in the funerary ritual dating back some 5,800 years to ancient Egypt. It is called, of all things, the ritual of opening the mouth. The function of this ritual was to purify, sanctify, and revivify the deceased, guard him against death and decay in the hereafter, reunite the spirit, the ka, the spirit or character, with the ba, the soul, and the kat, the corpse, to be reborn as a sahu, or spiritual being, transfer to him the strength, powers, and immortality of the gods, and open his mouth and eyes so that he may partake in the sepulchral offerings of food and drink. Furthermore, it was through this ritual that the sahu acquired the ability to speak, eat, breathe, think, see, hear, smell, and walk. His flesh and bones were reunited, his head reattached to his body, and his arms, legs, feet, and hands were once again under his control. He obtained twofold strength, all-encompassing knowledge, and was welcomed into the house of God, where he was to dwell throughout eternity in the presence of the gods. This ritual of opening the mouth begins by identifying the deceased with Osiris, a hero in Egyptian mythology and the god of the underworld. It then recalls in drama and incantation the death and rebirth of that great hero. Throughout the ritual, the kat, or the statue representing the kat, was purified, sanctified, and revivified with water, libations, incense, and ointments. The mouth and eyes were opened with various instruments which also transmitted life and power to the sahu. Near the end of the ritual, the sahu was said to have a mouth like that of a suckling calf on the day it was born. Numerous food offerings were presented to him. These always began with milk, cheese, or whey, and among other things, always included the presentation of an animal's breast, reflecting the sahu's rebirth and reunion with the mother. In the event that the ba, the soul, was not reunited with its kat, the corpse, and thereby initiated into a new way of being through the ritual of opening the mouth, it was quite simply a disembodied ba, a disembodied soul. The ba was said to be hungry, thirsty, could not speak or breathe, ate filth, and drank polluted water. He was said to have been sad, wandering in the desert, and bringing sickness, disease, and trouble in his path. His flesh and bones were not united, his head was separated from his body, and his body parts were out of voluntary control. He was powerless, isolated from the company of the gods, and most importantly, had not been spiritually born. The poetry, and I emphasize the word poetry, of the disembodied ba and the torment of the autistic child are striking indeed. Not only can the autistic child be viewed as a disembodied or poorly embodied soul, but he is also known to have profound eating and speech disturbances. He's frequently seen as very sad or depressed, and like the disembodied ba, often presents a behavior problem for others. He may have limited control over his body, distorted body perceptions, and or a poor body image. He lives in emotional isolation from the people around him, including his mother. In poetic terms, he has not left the seraphic realms, entered the mouth of this earthly world, and been psychologically born by way of a close relationship with a mothering figure. In France, as Francis Tustin would say, he has not come down to earth. Although the mythological motif of death and rebirth has long been known to play a central role in funerary rituals around the world, I have found that the image of the mouth as a passageway for the soul also plays an essential role in many of these rituals. The ancient Aztecs, the Chinese, the early Romans, the Spanish, the ancient Greek, the Laotians, the Turkish, the Pacific Islanders, and some of the tribes in Africa and North America, and many others, had some aspect of their funerary rituals that specifically involved the mouth. In most cases, a piece of jade, gold, a pearl, a ruby, water, a drop of honey, or a coin was placed in the mouth of the corpse. Although each culture attributed a slightly different meaning to this gesture, they all associated with giving the person strength or assistance in the travel to the world beyond. Several associate the item in the mouth either directly or indirectly with the soul itself. Examining the imagery associated with the ritual of opening the mouth and comparing it with the imagery associated with funerary rituals from around the globe, I found there to be three common motifs: reunion of the body and soul, 2, rebirth, and 3, reunion with the mother. These three motifs remind us of the healing task of the autistic child, who needs so desperately to 1, embody, 2, be psychologically born, and 3, enter into a warm relationship with a mother. The funerary ritual, based on the imagery associated with it, represents a correlate to the healing task of the autistic child, as well as to the early developmental task of the infant, making the transition from the normal autistic phase to the normal symbiotic phase of ego development, as Mahler described it. Or one could use any one of a number of other different developmental models to describe the emergence, you could say, of a psychological being in the infant. The degree to which one embodies is reflected in the degree to which the soul trusts its environment enough to let go, be swallowed, and send forth a rudimentary ego that will enter into relationship with a mother and be nourished. The degree to which one trusts is directly related to the degree to which one feels physically and psychically welcomed into the world. Thus, the strength and the integrity of the ego are reflected in the degree to which the soul has trusted to embody. If the autistic child can be said to feel unwelcome in the world, that is not to say that the child is unwelcome or that the parents have not welcomed the child, but rather that for whatever reason, the child feels unwelcome or cannot connect enough interpersonally to feel the welcome reception being offered. While it has long been noted that the infant comes to understand and incorporate much of his world by experiencing it through his mouth, I suggest that the soul of the infant is simultaneously being incorporated into the mouth of the human or earthly world. That is, being incorporated into its own body, family, and culture. It is a task not without dangers, for it represents engulfment and means becoming vulnerable to the pleasures and pains of human existence. It means leaving the celestial or hallucinated realms, becoming embodied in this earthly world, and being nourished in a warm maternal bond. The inability or unwillingness to leave these hallucinated realms and embody represents the mistrust of a soul that perceives the world as a hostile environment in which there is more pain than pleasure. Withholding its trust, the soul cannot embody. Unable or unwilling to embody and enter into relationship, the autistic child remains separate, aloof, above, and outside the world of warm human relations. This leaves him always desiring to enter the world, and yet paradoxically frozen in fear of being swallowed by it. And there he remains, alone, disconnected, figuratively poised above that mouth and its terrible teeth. Bettelheim writes, quote, "The infant, because of pain or discomfort and the anxiety they cause, or because he misreads the mother's actions or feelings, or correctly assesses her negative feelings, may retreat from her and the world. Any such retreat from the world tends to weaken the baby's impulse to observe and to act on the environment, though without such an impulse, personality will not develop. Retreat debilitates a young ego barely emerging from the undifferentiated stage and leads to still further psychic imbalance. Perhaps retreat is a similar but less poetic word for disembodied." Tustin wrote, quote, "The fall from the sublime state of blissful unity with the mother, who in early infancy is the sensation-dominated center of the infant's universe, is part of everyone's experience. However, for some individuals, for a variety of reasons, different in each case, the disillusionment of coming down to earth from the ecstatic experience has been such a hard and injurious experience that it has provoked impeding, encapsulating reactions," unquote. She goes on to say they feel they have nothing to hold on to and that they are falling down and down into nothingness. There seems to be no solid ground beneath their feet. To avoid this feeling of cataclysmic falling, they have resorted to the delusion that they are floating weightlessly, high above the ordinary world of human beings. They have escaped into a non-human realm, where to be or not to be is not an issue. Coming down to earth means that they have to face this issue. We have to bring them down to earth, whilst preserving but moderating their excessive vulnerability. As the auto-generated encapsulation is modified through the infantile transference, they have more satisfying experiences than they were able to have as a baby. As they embody these experiences, they begin to feel surrounded by a caring ambience. Tustin writes, quote, "Autism is anti-life, but anti-life is not synonymous with death. Dying is an inevitable part of the life process. Autistic techniques are reactions to avoid becoming conscious of the black hole of separation, of partings, of endings, and ultimately of death," unquote. All of a sudden, we're back at death, and death, or separation, as a way, metaphorically speaking, to be born psychologically. Tustin, referring to autistic children and the point at which they start drawing geometric forms, writes, quote, "The appearance of geometric forms seems to be an important step in psychic development. Such forms appear at a critical point in the psychotherapeutic process, when the patient is struggling out of the tomb womb of psychogenic autism to achieve what we metaphorically call psychic birth." Yes, we found our way back to the myth of death and rebirth as a metaphor of psychological birth, and the funerary ritual as a metaphor of the process of trusting and surrendering to the tomb womb of the great mother who promises new life. But to what extent is this a metaphor game? And to what extent does the myth of death and rebirth and the funerary ritual have anything to do whatsoever with autism, and more generally, with oral erotism? To begin to answer these sorts of questions, let us start by asking, to what extent can we generalize from the ancient Egyptian funerary ritual of opening the mouth to all funerary rituals? Well, wherever and whenever we find the funerary ritual, we always find the concept of the soul. The soul is that very basic spiritual belief that some essential aspect of the person will live on beyond physical death. It may take the ritual form of a recitation of the people, places, deities, and astral phenomena the soul may expect to encounter on its journey to the netherworld. In other rituals, offerings of food and supplies are made to the deceased to nourish and prepare him or her for life in the hereafter. An offshoot of this tradition of sepulchral food offerings is the funerary feast, in which the friends and loved ones participate in the death and rebirth of the deceased by first mourning the loss and then partaking in the food offerings. Further reference to funerary imagery symbolic of death and rebirth is found in the funerary boat, crypt, mausoleum, coffin, tomb, and cremation urn, all of which are associated with the womb of the Great Mother. In the funerary traditions of some cultures, the rebirth of the soul is acknowledged, but certainly not welcomed. In fact, in some of these cultures, the mouth is tied shut to keep the soul from escaping, and thereby causing trouble in the community and/or taking other members of the family to the land of the dead. With the ancient Egyptian ritual of opening the mouth as a model, we now turn our attention to a brief cross-cultural examination of funerary rituals. In some parts of China today, gold leaf and pearls are placed in the mouth of the deceased, and a ball of red paper mixed with ashes of incense is placed between the lips. In northern India, among the Muslim tribes, a few drops of honey are dripped into the mouth of the dying person. This is to sanctify the palate, and in doing so, strengthens the deceased, so it will not be tempted by the sweetmeats offered by the evil one who lies in wait for the soul. In a Jewish tradition, a blessing is recited immediately after death, stating, quote, "Blessed be the true judge," unquote. Then for the next 8 minutes the corpse is left untouched. A feather is placed on the lips, and everyone assembled watches attentively for the slightest sign of movement, presumably heralding the departure of the soul. In the funerary rites of the early Romans, it was common practice for the nearest relative to give the last kiss to the dying person at the moment of death. This was done in order to catch the soul, which was believed to leave the body through the mouth with the final breath. Later, a wreath was placed on the head and a coin placed in the mouth in order to pay Charon, the ferryman, for the ride across the river of death. The Chinese, as well as the English, were also said to have used this gesture of placing a coin in the mouth of the deceased to pay for the transport across the river of the dead. For the ancient Aztecs, afterlife meant facing the hazardous journey of passing through the 8 underworlds, the goal of which was to arrive safely in the 9th underworld for eternal rest. To prepare the deceased for the journey, they placed in the mouth a jade bead which served as a substitute heart and provided the necessary strength to safely proceed on this journey. The Ashanti tribe of Ghana in West Africa believed that at death the thirsting spirit has to climb a steep hill that leads to eternity. To assist in this task, family or friends present at the moment of death pour a little water into the parched throat of the deceased to ease the thirst before this great climb. The Santee Sioux of North America painted the faces of their dead with red paint, partly as decoration and partly as a preservative for the face. If he had been a great warrior, however, a black hand was painted on his mouth. If the myth of sacral kingship and the ancient New Year's festival are associated with the birth of civilization, at what point in cultural evolution would we locate the myth of death and rebirth and the funerary ritual of opening the mouth? We see here a presentation of the various aspects that John Ware Perry put together. The brief psychotic disorder with the myth of sacral kingship, the ancient New Year's festival, and the birth of civilization. And as I said, the one that he curiously omitted was that aspect of normal development, of adolescence, but which I was able to confirm with him in a personal conversation. Then I went on to begin to associate infantile autism with early infancy and the myth of death and rebirth, and the ancient funerary ritual. But I was puzzled here with how can I associate it with a stage in cultural evolution, or could I? Returning to our phylogenetic project, we recall John Perry's presentation of several parallel phenomena united by a set of metaphors in common. Subsequently, I presented these several other parallel phenomena also united by a set of metaphors in common. The connecting links within groups are a series of metaphors in common, but what is the relationship between the two groups of phenomena? Well, for one thing, adolescence is much later in the development than early infancy. And the brief psychotic disorder also manifests long after the first signs of infantile autism. So maybe the difference is developmental, and if so, we might find a link to phylogenetic evolution as well. That is, if the myth of sacral kingship and the New Year's festival are associated with the birth of civilization, at what point in cultural evolution would we pin the myth of death and rebirth and the funerary ritual of opening the mouth, or perhaps just the funerary ritual? Fortunately, we know the answer to that. The ritual of opening the mouth was written in full around 2,000 years ago, but it is clearly a ritual of great antiquity with origins and historical references dating back no later than the 4th dynasty, 5,800 years ago. That situates it firmly at the birth of civilization and coinciding with sacral kingship and the ancient New Year's festival. So now we've got them both lined up at the same time in cultural evolution. Got a question here. So now we've got a problem. The ritual of opening the mouth and the birth of civilization coincide temporally. And since the definition of civilization includes the beginning of writing and literature, how can we pursue the origins of the funerary rituals any earlier than the birth of civilization? Well, if we confine ourselves to literature, clearly we cannot. But if we allow the archaeological data to speak, or at least suggest, we may indeed be able to get some ideas about the antiquity of the funerary ritual. In a Bronze Age burial excavated near Nazareth, Israel, the body was not only laid to rest in a large clay pot, symbolic of the womb, but the corpse was even placed in a fetal position. The inhabitants of Chalcolithic Israel had a custom of placing the bones of their dead in urns that had been shaped to look like those of houses of the living. At Hasalar, located in western Turkey, the dead, about 5,600 years ago, the dead were found buried either under a house or under the courtyard. They were in the fetal or contracted position and were accompanied with clay bowls, beads, cups, and bone pins. At Nicomedia, on the eastern coast of the Grecian peninsula, an early Neolithic settlement was unearthed and found to be the oldest European Neolithic site ever discovered. It was 6,220 years ago, the burial site. In the article reporting this discovery, the author marvels at this people's seemingly small regard for the dead. He cites the burial location outside the house walls and lack of personal adornment or sepulchral offerings, and the way they were, quote, crammed into a barely adequate depression, unquote. He then goes on to state that, quote, in one enigmatic instance, however, a skeleton was found with a large pebble thrust between its jaws, unquote. Other burial sites at Ainon were found underneath the houses or under the floors of caves, being used as living spaces. In one such burial, 8,500 BC, a chieftain was found with his skull propped up so as to be facing the snowy peaks of Mount Hermon. In this particular case, as in many others, the chieftain was buried under the floor of a roundhouse, and in the center of the floor was built a stone hearth. In France, a skeleton was discovered under a rock shelter and found to be in the familiar fetal position and tinged with red ochre. Another 5 well-preserved skeletons, also sprinkled with red ochre, were found in a cave at San Teodoro, Sicily. Both the French and Italian discoveries were determined to have been from the late Upper Paleolithic. At Sungir, 130 miles east of Moscow, a grave site for a 55-year-old man was uncovered. The grave had been sprinkled with red ochre prior to his burial, and still more sprinkled on the corpse after it was set in place. He was dressed in leather clothes and had ivory beads stitched onto them. He wore 24 bracelets made of mammoth ivory, a necklace made of pierced Arctic fox teeth, and 1,500 bone ornaments. He was buried 23,000 years ago. In the rugged Zagros mountains of northern Iraq, there is a cave known as the Big Cave of Shanidar. A Neanderthal was found buried there in the floor of the cave on a bed of branches and bright colorful flowers. These flowers were identified by the microscopic examination of pollen found in the soil below and surrounding the bones. They were identified as being flowers representing numerous species related to the brightly colored grape hyacinth, bachelor's button, hollyhock, and groundsel. This flower burial site is 60,000 years old. Then there is the School Cave in Mount Carmel in Israel, where there were found 8 male and 10 female Homo sapiens intentionally buried. One skeleton was an adult male, apparently buried with his hand clasping a jawbone of a wild boar. This intentional burial and apparent funeral was conducted 90,000 years ago. Bones have long been said to contain the souls of the dead, and this is especially the case with skulls and jawbones. We might imagine that as this man set off for the land of the dead, he was strengthened by the spirit of the boar, which he had incorporated into his own being by killing it, eating it, and possessing its jawbone. Or perhaps it was his totem. Again, for perspective, we should remember that while the ancient Egyptian ritual of opening the mouth is 5,800 years old, this grave with the Neanderthal man, this was actually Homo sapiens, clasping the boar's jawbone, is about 90,000 years old. It also reminds us of the recurring association of death, rebirth, and the symbolism of the mouth, the jawbone in this case. While the School Cave burial is the oldest funerary rite to be discovered thus far, evidence of cannibalism reaches back to an even earlier time and underscores this theme of the incorporation of the soul of the victim into the mouth of the victor. While the flower burial of Shanidar and the Skull Cave burials give evidence of the antiquity of the spiritual principle of death and rebirth, the cannibalistic rituals provide evidence and the antiquity of this most basic of spiritual concepts, the concept of the human soul and its oral incorporation. There are sites in which there have been found evidence of Middle Paleolithic burials and cannibalism, but they do not become really common until the Upper Paleolithic. And now we can add the phylogenetic dimension to our 2 lists. Infantile autism, early infancy, the myth of death and rebirth, ancient funerary ritual, and the Upper Paleolithic. And the other list would be the brief psychotic disorder, adolescence, the myth of sacral kingship, the ancient New Year's festival, and the birth of civilization. And with these 2 points in the spectrum of cultural evolution established, we are now in a position to ask, what were the spiritual developments, psychological developments, the defensive strategies of cultures to deal with their lives? What were these spiritual developments in the cultural evolution between the Upper Paleolithic and the birth of civilization? And in what way are they related to the stages of psychological development between infancy and adolescence.